They didn't just want you dead. They wanted the world to watch you fall apart. This was a punishment so gruesome, so excruciatingly drawn out, that death itself felt like mercy. It wasn't carried out in the shadows of a dungeon, but marched through the streets for all to see. Not a hidden execution, a public spectacle. It started with ropes and ended with 4 horses ripping your body into pieces. This is the horror of drawing and quartering. A sentence reserved not for petty thieves or common murderers, but for traitors. The most despised criminals in medieval England, but also, sometimes, the most political. It's London. The year is 1305. A cold wind snakes through the narrow alleys of Smithfield Market. Merchants freeze mid-sail. Children clutch their mothers' hands tightly. Something terrible is about to happen. You hear it before you see it. The rhythmic rattle of chains, the crunch of wooden wheels, and then a man tied to a hurdle is dragged behind a horse through mud and waste. The crowd jeers. Some throw stones, but some watch in quiet horror. The man's name? William Wallace. Yes, that William Wallace, the Scottish rebel immortalized by Hollywood. But what the movies didn't show you. This is what really happened to him, because being hanged was just the beginning. During the Middle Ages, England was obsessed with order, with loyalty, punishing those who dared defy the crown. Treason wasn't just betrayal, it was blasphemy. To turn on your king was to turn on God. And the punishment for such a sin had to be a spectacle, so cruel, so unforgettable, that it burned itself into the soul of the nation. That punishment was being drawn and quartered. But how did this practice come to be? Who decided that tearing a man into 4 pieces was justice? Stick with me, because this story is far darker than you think. We're going to peel back every layer of this execution. We'll walk through each step, from dragging to disembowelment to the final slicing of limbs. We'll meet the historical figures who suffered it, and we'll ask the real question: was this justice, or was it control through terror? If you think you've heard of brutal punishments, you haven't seen anything yet. Where kings rule by blood, the birth of a brutal sentence. Imagine a time when kings ruled by divine right, where their crown was not just a symbol of power, but of God's will. To defy a king then wasn't simply rebellion, it was sacrilege. And in this twisted theocracy of blood and banners, punishment became a form of holy vengeance. This is where the horror of drawing and quartering begins, not in the dungeons of torturers, but in the minds of monarchs. Welcome to medieval England, a kingdom built not just on iron, but on fear. The first recorded case of someone being drawn and quartered dates back to the 13th century under the reign of King Henry III. But it was his successor, King Edward I, the same man who waged brutal wars against Scotland and Wales, who would turn this punishment into a national ritual. Edward wasn't just a ruler, he was a tactician of terror, and he knew, if you want to stop rebellion, don't just kill the rebel, give him a warning. Make his pain so loud it echoes into silence. Make his death so brutal no one dares follow. Thus, the sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered became law. But what did it actually mean? Let's break it down, piece by horrifying piece. In official language, the punishment for high treason, according to English law, went as follows: that the traitor be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until dead, or nearly so, that he be disemboweled, and his bowels burned before him while yet alive, beheaded, and his body divided into 4 parts to be disposed of at the king's pleasure. Let that sink in. The words are cold, clinical. But behind them lies a process so gruesome, so intentionally painful, that it bordered on ritualistic torture. Why such detail? Because the state wanted more than blood. It wanted obedience. It wanted fear that didn't fade, even after the body was gone. Breaking it down. The 4 pillars of horror. Let's look at what each part of the punishment meant, not just in action, but in symbolism. 1. Drawn to death. Contrary to popular belief, drawing didn't mean the person was immediately quartered. It referred to the condemned being dragged, often tied to a wooden hurdle or sled, through the streets by a horse. Why? Because walking was too dignified. Being carried would suggest mercy. No. You were to be hauled like a carcass, through mud, through feces, through the jeers of the crowd. Your body is battered. Your clothes are torn. Name erased by shame. And sometimes this drawing took hours. This was the first step, humiliation. 2. Hanged, but not to death. Next came the hanging, but not the hanging you imagine. Not a clean, neck-breaking drop. This was a slow suspension. The victim was strung up, often with no platform beneath them. They would dangle, choke, twitch, eyes bulging, tongue swelling. But before they died, they were cut down. This was psychological cruelty. You could feel death's breath, but not receive its mercy. 3. The dismembering begins. Disembowelment. The executioner would take a blade, not sharp like a guillotine, but rugged and serrated, and slice open the stomach. Intestines were pulled out slowly, often still pulsing, and then burned. Yes, your own organs were set on fire before your eyes while you still breathed. This wasn't just physical torture, it was symbolic, the traitor's inner evil being purged by flame. Some victims would pass out from shock. Some would scream until their vocal cords tore. Others remained eerily silent. 4th, beheading and quartering. Finally, the condemned was beheaded, often while still alive, though weakened. And then the body was quartered, cut into 4 pieces. Each limb was severed. Each quarter is sometimes displayed in a different part of the kingdom. A hand in York, a leg in Dover, a torso on London Bridge. The message was clear: here lies the price of treason. This was political messaging through mutilation. The question you're probably asking is, why not just execute them? Why go through all this? Why the dragging, the hanging, the gutting, the splitting? Simple. Because terror works better when it's memorable, and nothing stays in the mind like a spectacle. The monarchy knew that fear, once seen, becomes generational. The horror your father watched would be passed to you. The smell, the screams, inherited like a curse. Drawing and quartering wasn't just punishment, it was policy, strategy. The Encyclopedia Britannica notes that this gruesome method of capital punishment was used particularly against those who betrayed their sovereign, and was intended not just to kill, but to destroy the traitor's honor, body, and legacy. That's crucial. This wasn't just about ending a life. It was about erasing it. The British monarchy believed that rebellion started in the mind, so they waged war on memory itself. If you've made it this far, take a moment. Breathe. This history is hard to hear, but it's important. If you're finding this eye-opening or even disturbing, let us know in the comments. What's your reaction to this brutal sentence? And make sure to subscribe for more chilling, hidden chapters of our past. Because trust me, what comes next is even worse. The hero torn apart, the real execution of William Wallace. The bells of Westminster toll heavily through the fog. A horse clatters down the cobbled road dragging something behind it. Not a cart, not a body, a man, chained to a wooden hurdle. William Wallace, Scotland's most defiant rebel, is dragged through the filth of London streets. He is bruised, barely conscious, and barely clothed. Behind him, a trail of blood. Ahead of him, a scaffold. This is not a fair trial. It is a theater, a royal performance of revenge. This is how empires bury heroes. Forget the Hollywood version. No blue face paint, no last-minute cavalry. The real William Wallace was captured in August 1305 by English forces. His crime? Leading a resistance against the English crown. To Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, Wallace wasn't a warrior. He was a traitor. And traitors deserved more than death. They deserved obliteration. At his trial, if you could call it that, Wallace wasn't allowed to speak in his defense. He was mocked, chained, and publicly denounced as a murderer, robber, and savage. But the people watching knew better. To many Scots, even some Londoners, he was a symbol. And that's what made him so dangerous. They tied Wallace to a hurdle, a wooden frame, and lashed it behind a horse. The journey from Westminster Hall to Smithfield Market took hours. Why? Because they made it long on purpose. Every bounce, every stone, every sharp edge of cobble was part of the sentence. His skin tore, his bones cracked. Crowds gathered along the route, some to cheer, others to stare in stunned silence. The king didn't want Wallace merely dead. He wanted him broken. At Smithfield they hanged Wallace by the neck, but not to kill. He struggled, air hissing through his throat, his eyes bulging from the sockets. But just before unconsciousness, they cut him down. He gasped, not out of relief, but because the worst was still to come. They strapped him to a bench. The executioner took a curved blade and sliced Wallace from his sternum down. Out spilled his intestines. No anesthesia, no mercy, and while he was still alive, they threw his entrails into a fire, one handful at a time. Spectators said Wallace never screamed, not once. But his body twitched violently as if his soul was clawing to escape. Then they castrated him, because humiliation was part of justice. At last they cut off his head, but even that wasn't the end. Wallace's body was divided into 4 quarters. A leg was sent to Perth, another to Aberdeen, a third to Newcastle, and the last to Berwick. His head? Spiked and displayed on London Bridge, a grim trophy for all to see. And there it remained, rotting in public view. A message to the kingdom. This is what happens when you rise against the king. William Wallace wasn't just killed, he was erased. And yet, despite the horror, Wallace's legend only grew. Scotland didn't break, it hardened, and the English crown learned something it didn't expect. Pain may kill the body, but it can't always kill the idea. Can you imagine facing that kind of death? Not just dying, but knowing that your execution would be turned into a message for future generations. Would you stay silent? Or would you, like Wallace, endure the unimaginable just to hold on to your truth? Let us know in the comments. Was Wallace's execution justice or tyranny in its most theatrical form? And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because what's coming next will change how you see royal justice forever. The Crown's cruel theater, when justice became spectacle. The platform is raised. The headsman sharpens his axe. A royal clerk reads from a scroll, his voice echoing across the crowd. Below him, a man trembles, bound, pale, soaked in sweat. He's not a king, not a noble, not even a soldier. He's a writer. His crime? Speaking against the king. In a few minutes, his organs will burn in front of him. His body will be ripped apart, and thousands of citizens will cheer. This was not just punishment. This was entertainment. By the late 14th century, public executions had become a regular part of life in England. Markets would close, children would climb shoulders, vendors sold pies. It was a festival of death, one where the price of treason was the showstopper. But why? Why would ordinary citizens, bakers, farmers, cobblers, take their families to watch a man gutted alive? Because the crown made sure they did. This wasn't random cruelty. It was choreographed terror. The English monarchy understood something chilling. A spectacle reaches more minds than a sword ever could. Every element of drawing and quartering was designed to teach a lesson. The dragging through the streets ensured everyone saw your shame. The hanging and disembowelment ensured they heard your agony. The quartered remains nailed to gates and bridges ensured they never forgot your fate. This was moral architecture built from blood. Each body part was placed strategically across the country, like grisly warning signs. Turn back, stay loyal, obey. Many assumed drawing and quartering was only for traitorous knights or foreign invaders. But England's definition of treason was flexible and frighteningly political. Let's look at some victims. Hugh Despencer, 1326, a powerful noble and close advisor to King Edward II. But when Edward's enemies seized power, Despencer was arrested and accused of treason. He was stripped naked, drawn through the streets, hanged until half dead, castrated and disemboweled, beheaded and quartered. But get this, his genitals were burned before him, a symbolic punishment meant to destroy not only his body, but his lineage. The message was brutal and clear. You serve the wrong king, you die in shame. Thomas Armstrong, 1684. A Protestant loyalist accused of conspiring against the Catholic King James II. He denied it. But denial didn't matter. He was sentenced to be drawn on a hurdle, hanged without the drop, disemboweled while still breathing, beheaded and quartered. His head was placed on Westminster Hall, his limbs nailed to the city gates. The spectators cheered, but Armstrong's final words? I die for England, not her rulers. Even in agony, he claimed dignity. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the purpose of such gruesome punishment was both retributive and deterrent. It not only removed the traitor, but served as a visceral warning to others. Visceral is right. This was visual government, power not written in laws, but painted in blood on brick walls. The public nature of drawing and quartering wasn't just about control, it was about participation. Crowds didn't just watch, they jeered. They sometimes threw stones or rotten food. They belonged to the process. And that's the darkest truth. Tyranny survives not just because of kings, but because of crowds willing to watch. The real power of the punishment lay in the days after the death. Picture it. You walk across London Bridge and see a man's head rotting on a spike. Crows peck at it. You don't know his name, but you know his mistake. That image stays with you. It becomes part of your childhood, your prayers, your nightmares. That is psychological governance. Now ask yourself this. Could you have watched? If you lived in 1500, would you have stood in the front row at Tyburn, cheering as a man was pulled apart? Or would you have turned away? It's easy to say no now, but remember, back then, silence was dangerous. What would you have done? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your reaction. By the late 1600s, drawing and quartering was still used, but slowly public appetite began to shift. People began to question, was this justice or barbarity dressed in robes? But the monarchy held firm. So long as rebellion was possible, so too was public horror. And yet, even horror has an expiration date. The last quarter. How England buried its most brutal punishment. The sky over Tyburn is unusually quiet. The usual carnival crowd isn't as loud. The executioner sharpens his blade slowly, perhaps even reluctantly. And on the scaffold stands a man named David Tyree. He knows what's coming, the ropes, the blade, the division of his body into quarters. He is the last man in British history to be sentenced to the full horror of drawing and quartering. But even as the ropes tighten and the blade rises, something else is changing, something behind the eyes of the crowd. A question, do we still need this? The final victim, David Tyree, 1782. David Tyree was a bank clerk, but also a secret agent. During the American Revolutionary War, he was found guilty of passing naval intelligence to the French, high treason, the ancient crime, and by law the ancient punishment applied. He was drawn to the place of execution, hanged by the neck, cut down before death, disemboweled, beheaded, quartered. But unlike the centuries before, this time. The crowd wasn't cheering. They were staring. Some gasped, some turned away. The spell had broken. For over 500 years, drawing and quartering remained enshrined in English law. Even as science advanced, even as Enlightenment thinkers questioned cruelty, the punishment stayed. Why? Because power, once given, dies slowly. It took generations for England's rulers to admit what they already knew. This wasn't justice. This was vengeance. The horror had outlived its purpose. Public executions were increasingly viewed as spectacles of cruelty, not of justice. In the 18th century, attitudes toward capital punishment shifted dramatically, particularly in regard to methods involving torture. This was the dawn of a new era, one where the crowd didn't cheer. They questioned. The Enlightenment brought philosophers who attacked the idea of spectacle justice. Cesare Beccaria, an Italian criminologist, wrote in 1764, "It is not the cruelty of punishment that deters crime, but the certainty of it." His words resonated in England. Parliament began debating reform. Newspapers began criticizing the monarchy's grip of fear. For the first time, people wondered, can a government be strong without being savage? The slow death of the sentence. In 1814, Parliament abolished quartering for women. In 1843, disembowelment was officially removed. And finally, in 1870, drawing and quartering was abolished entirely from British law. It took nearly 6 centuries to end, but in the end, it ended. Take a moment and think, not just about the cruelty of this punishment, but the time it took to stop it. Countless lives were torn apart, heads were left to rot on bridges, a gruesome warning to all. Children grew up believing this horror was just another part of life. Drop your thoughts in the comments. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we let happen. Drawing and quartering is a horror from the past, but it's the lesson. Timeless. It shows how governments use fear to shape obedience. It reveals the dark underbelly of public punishment, not to reform, but to warn. Not to heal, but to scar. And most chilling of all, it reminds us how long it takes for the human conscience to catch up with justice. Thank you for coming with us on this dark journey into the heart of medieval justice. If this story gripped you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, give this video a thumbs up. Hit subscribe for more untold truths from history. And please, share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these stories alive and these lessons remembered. We don't just study the past to know what happened. We study it to never let it happen again. When governments punish with fire and the sword, it's not the body they fear. It's the idea it carries. Let's not forget that. Not now, not ever.